Good morning, everybody. This is Chief Zaid Bell. I've been looking at some of the comments on Facebook and other apps with respect to what Métis are. A lot of confusion out there, especially now where funding is being restricted to various Aboriginal groups. There was a recent article, document, whatever, that the Métis National Council in Manitoba represents the Script Indians and other, or Script Métis and other Métis out in the Manitoba homeland, the Métis homeland, which they've just recently posted again. They took it down a few years ago, but the Métis National Homeland is west of Dryden. And if you're a Métis Nation of Ontario member, I guess there's some kind of fighting between the two of them in regards to could be funding. I don't know. They're restricting Métis National Council membership unless you're a member or have a historic basis in the Métis National Homeland. The result of that, we've had many Métis Nation members, Métis Nation of Ontario members, who are looking to see where that leaves them if they're actually Métis from Ontario. Now, I refer you to go back to the Polly case where Harry Belcourt was talking about how the Métis Nation was created. It's a political lobbyist group in Ontario. It was created at the time of the Polly case in regards to shooting a moose, and he talked in his discussions in that document. I'm still looking for my copy of that, but it's out there somewhere. You can research it, where he finds a Métis who has no community, they create a community, adopt them, and etc. That's in the legal record, so people can research that. There's a lot of effort has to go in to truly understand what's going on in Métis politics. There used to be the OMSI, the Ontario Status and Non-Status Indian Living Off Reserve, when the 1982 created the Métis in the Constitution of Canada as one of the three Aboriginal people. They changed their name to the Ontario Métis Aboriginal Association. It was a political lobbyist group. I believe it had a corporate number. It was under the Corporation Act. Every not-for-profit corporation in Canada, depending on which province or federally, who sign up a political lobbyist group or a not-for-profit corporation, all the assets of that corporation are actually owned by those governments. So they're basically a third or fourth party service provider for the Crown to provide various aspects of community needs, right? So the current funding mechanism of the governments of Canada and for Ontario is that they consider these not-for-profit political lobbyist groups service providers, and how they've broken it down, since the Métis National Council was representing Métis people across Canada at one time. I don't know what the status is now, but they seem to be restricted back to the Métis National Homeland west of Dryden, Ontario, the old Manitoba border. But the government considers them service provider. So those who didn't want to become part of the Métis National Council were part of the Congress of Aboriginal People, which is based out of Ottawa, and that was another service provider. So the federal funding to provide services to various political lobbyist groups that are classified in the Aboriginal service provision, they split the funding between CAP, Congress of Aboriginal People, and the Métis National Council. And then each of those organizations have territorial units, and in Ontario, OMA used to be the representative for OCAP, the Congress of Aboriginal People. So OMA and Métis Nation were kind of two significant political lobbyist groups in Ontario were vying over the provincial funds. Well, one year, supposedly OMA's annual request for funding for the province wasn't submitted, and they just about went bankrupt. They survived through that 5 years of lack of provincial funding, and they got back onto the provincial funding mechanism, where Métis Nation of Ontario got all the provincial funding from the province of Ontario for I forget, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 years, I'm not sure. Then they started getting equal funding for service provision. Then after the Daniels case, there was a comment made by someone to the RCMP that OMA was fraudulent in the usage of the money that they had in related to Polly case. So because the province said, well, if you've been accused of, and I believe this was the way it was told to me, I'm just verily believe this is fairly accurate, OMA didn't receive funding from the province because they couldn't fund a group that supposedly had fraudulent action. So after 5 years of an RCMP investigation for OMA, they found that OMA did not do anything wrong. There was a minor few glitches in, a few cents here and a few cents there, but nothing wrong. But by that time, OMA had gone bankrupt, the political lobbyist group. OMA still exists up in the Dryden Thunder Bay area. They are a tribe, they're a historic tribe, and they have quite a substantial membership, but I don't believe they get any funding from the government either, okay? So the current situation is that the government considers these political lobbyist groups service providers, and they control them. If you look on the website of the AFN, they say right there their activities are actually controlled by the Minister of Justice. So if you have the federal justice minister controlling the actions of a political lobbyist group, you got to wonder what's going on and how that funding goes on. I know right now the government is in a big issue about funding, and they're cutting back all across the not-for-profit sector of funding. So how do you maximize the utilization of the funding you get? Well, you go through your membership rolls and see who you can get kicked out. Now, I'm not suggesting, excuse me, still got that cold. I'm not suggesting that that's what the Métis National Council is doing, but if you look at the history of the Métis National Council and why they're trying to represent their membership, they're basically script Métis from the Manitoba Act, and they do have a national homeland. That's been well advertised in their websites going way back. They took it down for a while, but I've seen that there's a new posting of the Métis National Homeland on various social media, etc. So the whole issue of what a Métis and what a Métis isn't and who recognizes you, well, the way you surrender any group is to get them sign a contract. Everything in Canada is contract law. So if you're getting groups to sign contracts, in other words, a contract, a document, an application for a not-for-profit corporation, you have signed a contract with the federal government. And result of that, you are expecting or you do get funding or other services because you sign a contract. So those groups that have signed contracts with the federal government or the provincial government have actually surrendered to the Crown. Now there's 13, 14 crowns of Canada. They've broken them up under the Division of Powers of the British North American Act, but you really have to look at all this history. So the current situation is that when the Daniels case was set up just after 1982 to create the new Constitution, there was a law case with Gardner and Daniels, and I forget the other gentleman's name at the moment. It took, 34 years to go to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court was supposed to decide on Métis and non-status Indian rights. Now, you really have to read the Daniels decision because there's a lot of changes. The only Supreme Court decision in regards to Métis rights was the Pauli case about if you're connected with a historic Métis community before effective control, you could shoot a moose. And that was the only identified legal commitment to the Métis people of Canada of what they could do on their traditional land. Well, if you're hooked into a Métis with a status card, an Indian status card, and there's lots of them, you're confined by the Indian Act. Those Métis that have never been connected to a First Nation, and the government of Canada only wanted to recognize First Nations, they didn't want to have Métis reservations or reserves like they have in after the decision in Alberta in 1932 or 36, where they created the Métis settlement lands, which they finally got those lands sometime in the 70s. Ontario didn't want to do that because Ontario is a huge resource-based economy, or that time, based on the forestry, which they've split up and given all kinds of corporations forestry rights under the forest management units, and mining, where they get a major resource for the big city of Toronto, all comes from mining in the north. So it's a total control over those resource capacities in Ontario. So you really have to look at what the basis of all these organizations were and what they were all about. In regards to the harvesting rights, the Métis Nation of Ontario got. I think I mentioned this in another video. That was a contract law dispute, went to court, and the judge says, well, you had a contract with them, you have to uphold your end of the contract, so therefore you got to give them harvesting cards. So they're not Métis rights, because Supreme Court decisions, I forget which one, says corporations can have Aboriginal membership, they can be owned by Aboriginals, but they don't have any Aboriginal rights. So a corporation getting Métis harvesting cards, that's not an Aboriginal right, that's just a corporate contract law dispute resolution. So where we are right now, the government funds the CAP, the Congress of Aboriginal People, and their Ontario service provider, where they funnel funds down from the federal government to the local organization. OMA used to be the representative for Ontario for OCAP, which was the feds did the Métis National Council and OCAP, or Congress of Aboriginal People. Well, the Congress of Aboriginal People used to fund that money down to OMA, and then it split up when OMA went bankrupt. The corporation of OMA went bankrupt, the association. That money went to the newly formed OCAP, the Ontario Coalition of Aboriginal People. And they get the funding through, as well as Métis Nation, from Ontario and the feds. I don't think they get a lot of money like the Métis Nation of Ontario. So what the Métis Nation of Ontario, it's really done a framework agreement with Ontario, etc. But they're just a service provider. They are giving those services to Aboriginal people, which you would get those same type of services if you're non-Aboriginal people. It's just another functionality of the provincial government. Now, I know a lot of people dispute this. Oh, I'm Métis, I'm a member of the Métis Nation. Great, I'm glad you are, but the thing is, you got to know what you belong to. I know originally back in the 2000s, 2003-4, if you looked at the Métis Nation of Ontario application, you actually gave up your Aboriginal rights to that corporation. So you surrendered to that corporation, and supposedly you could not be member of any other association. Now, that's historic. I don't know what the current status is, because I'm not really bothered about the Métis Nation and what they're doing. They're just a political lobbyist group. They may have Aboriginal membership, and they're doing their thing. That's fine. But with respect to where you are as a Métis, really look at the Daniels or Pauly's case that gave the definitive what how you become a Métis in the eyes of the government's acknowledgement of you. You had to have profess to be Métis, have an Aboriginal ancestor, and be member of a historic Métis community, Greek and Roman fence, pre-effective control of the government, and they said it was in the 1850s or something up in Sault Ste. Marie, because that's when they went up there to start getting all the lumber. They weren't really going up in the north. They started logging in Manitoulin Island back in the late 1800s, the same thing up there. And basically it was still just fur trade and the odd person going up in the north in the mid 1800s. It wasn't that long ago. So I lost my train of thought. But anyhow, where we are now is that there are groups across Canada that have never surrendered. Some of them are small communities. Some have large families, and Asmin has tremendous volume of family members, relations that can track their ancestry and are Métis if they want to self-profess. And we've had these discussions with INAC. I think I put a comment back on the Facebook comment there today. But when we met with the lawyers of Indian Affairs, they said, we don't know what to do with you. We don't have the policies or the mandates through even in INEC at that time, because they were just dealing with essentially Indians under the Indian Act. We can't do anything for you, so you got to have to sue us. When the Queen instructed Canada to go into UN negotiations under the Treaty Handbook Protocol, we did have one meeting with one of the senior under the Indian Lands group, and I was told to go check out this guy who was going to help us. He didn't work there anymore. 6 months later, I finally found a guy, and he said, "Oh, sorry, Chief, I can't deal with you. I have no policy or mandate to deal with you because we don't give you any money." You see, so that's how the government is dealing. They only deal with those that they fund. That's how they can control. So if you want to know who you are, you got to do your genealogical and DNA and testing, though the government, again, doesn't want to look at DNA because it might prove that you are Aboriginal. You have to do your own private journey of who you are as a Métis. And you got to do a lot of research. And you can't take statements of anyone, including me. You have to do your research yourself. But we're in that process. We are in the courts right now on Métis rights. You won't hear about stuff in court because while it's in court, you can't hear about what's going on in court. But we have Superior Court of Justice. We have cases under the Law Society of Upper Canada. We have cases to the College of Physicians and Surgeons right now. I think that case is going in sometime in January. There's all kinds of stuff going on with respect to what our nation is doing. We're doing international stuff, but you can't talk about that right now because the government will try to interfere if they knew what you were doing internationally, right? And we've had those, I would say, we've had concerns with regards to activities of the federal government. Now, Canada is just totally in crazy situation right now with what the government's doing. But anyhow, the comment today was, oh, our card wasn't recognized by the government. Well, our card is recognized by government, but they just don't want to tell anyone our card's recognized by government. We've had no issue with our card. There are some groups that are being charged for printing cards because they're making wrong statements on their cards. Our cards are not cheap tobacco cards. They're not gas cards. They're separate contractual agreements with the political lobbyist groups that are working with the government. And usually that only has to do with First Nations under the Indian Act or Indians as bands under the Indian Act. So you really have to understand the politics of Métis-ishness, whatever. But right now we're supposedly, the Constitution says we're Métis. The Daniels case now says we're Indians, but we're not under the Indian Act. But they really didn't identify what our rights were, but they removed one of the conditions of the Pauli case where you had to be a member of a historic community. So you don't have to be a member of historic community. We don't have Greco-Roman fence. They played that game on Louis Riel. Well, you don't own the land, you don't have a farm, you don't have a deed to the land, so you don't own it. Well, now they've kind of moved away from that. We don't have Greco-Roman fences. And we've got a huge population base all over Canada. You can't put them all in one spot or you're going to need to build another city the size of Toronto. So I don't know if that helps or not, but it was an interesting comment. Well, the government of Canada doesn't recognize us. Well, what does that mean? Recognition in the frame of the lawyers and the senior in the Indian lands claim, unless they fund you, they have no policy to deal with you. They've been talking for 4 years now to setting up a Métis policy of how to engage with Métis. And I was talking with the head lawyer who's part of that, and he was going to contact me back, and I've heard nothing from them because they only deal with those political lobbyist groups. Like we tried to go to the meeting in Ottawa with the government last week or the week before, but they're only dealing with those groups that they fund. So if you're not funded, they don't deal with you. So what does recognition mean? Well, they recognize us. They send us letters all the time. Chief and counsel, all kinds of stuff like that. That's recognition in a competent court of jurisdiction. So they recognize us, but they just don't fund us. So when you're looking at a Métis citizenship card to a political lobbyist group, okay, what does that mean? Well, they've set up little backroom deals with the province of Ontario for various services, and we have some lawyers reviewing right now that situation because have a lot of universities, etc., denying bona fide card carriers from other groups, including ours, those services they only give to the Métis Nation of Ontario because the only Métis group in Ontario that's recognized by the government is the feds. Well, I guess, when you compare what a not-for-profit corporation, that's the same as the Canadian Centre for the Blind and all these other not-for-profits. You know, they have a card. So are they only recognizing the Métis Nation of Ontario membership card to provide services? That's a violation of human rights based on race, creed, color, point of origin, and our lawyers are looking at those different situations as well. So anyhow, we're not political. We're just doing our thing. And Asmin is moving along. You know, my family's been here since before from time immemorial, but on the French side, since before the beginning of New France. So anyhow, I don't know if that was helpful. I threw a lot of information at you, but you got to do your research to realize what a Métis is. You're self-professed, and you know your ancestry. You can be adopted into a tribe, which is well established in the Indian Act. All kinds of stuff out there. So you all have a good day. Bon mapi.